Thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited to be speaking with you all today. I am one of the three co-leads, as Heather mentioned, of the Adopting Urban Environments for the Future theme of the MSSI. And I'm super excited to be sharing with you on behalf of myself and the co-leads, Kevin Manaugh and Annie Gonzalez, a sneak peek at one of the projects we've been developing. There's been a lot happening in our theme, but we're going to just put every except for one thing to the side so that I have a whole 10 minutes to dig into what you see in front of you right now, which is SUS. This is our urban sustainability dashboard, which we've been developing for the last several years, and is now we're now at the point where we're able to share a sneak peek of what we've been doing. I'm going to start clicking around in a second and give you a taste of what's on the dashboard. But before I do that, I want to motivate it for a minute with to describe the challenge that we're confronting with this piece of work. Kevin, Andy, and I, as well as, excuse me, I have two cats currently on my desk, so this is a status update. You may be seeing some tails in front of, oh, there we go. One of the challenges that Kevin, Andy, and I have been collectively grappling with, along with our broader team in the urban theme, is the kind of disjuncture between an increasingly sophisticated theoretical understanding of how cities function as nodes in social systems, but also socio-environmental systems. So a kind of a sophisticated theoretical understanding on the one hand, and on the other hand, some real gaps in terms of how we can put that sophisticated knowledge to practice in policymaking, in community advocacy, in empirical research as well. In particular, we found ourselves frequently motivated by the thought that if you are an urban planner working for the city of Montreal, or any of a number of different positions within the kind of broad spectrum of actors who have some responsibility for trying to improve our urban environments, if you're an urban planner and you are really motivated to incorporate sustainability concerns into your decision making, how would you do that? And sometimes there's an easy answer, but sometimes not. And so, one of the challenges we've been trying to tackle is, can we help provide tools that let us kind of intersect all the different complex features of how natural systems and human systems interact in urban spaces, in a tool that's designed to let us explore, let us learn, let us do research, and ultimately let us kind of move policymaking forward. We're not done. This is a big challenge, and we haven't solved it exactly, but we at least have, I think, the start of that, and that is our urban sustainability dashboard, which we call SUS. So here it is in front of us, and what I'm going to do for the next several minutes is give a kind of a very quick whistle-stop tour of some of the features. Now, eventually, there's going to be a lot more here, and only some of what is on the screen right now is really polished. I want to highlight a couple of things that the sustainability dashboard can do. And I'm going to start by clicking on the active living potential topic over here. What we're now looking at is a map in the Montreal region of neighborhoods' potential for active living as captured by the CanAle Index, which was developed by McGill researchers to capture different differential ability for people to live active lives as far as population density goes, what's around them, the structure of the street grid, and how close they are to active transit. So when we start, we see a map. It's broken down by borough or by city. And immediately what we get a picture of is strong geographic disparities in potential for active living across the region. Where the central part of Montreal has a very high potential for active living, which declines in the periphery and declines even more once you're off island. On the right, we see some kind of quick numbers and words kind of describing the situation. So we see a distribution of the potential for active living across neighborhoods, as well as a bit of description. And we can click on a given neighborhood. So let's choose Ville Marie, which is where McGill is based, of course, and learn that Ville Marie is actually the borough across the Montreal region with the highest potential for active living as measured by this index. If you want to learn more about the index, you can do that with additional methodological description, as well as links out to research done by McGill researchers, including in this case, a paper that our team wrote over the summer, supported by the MSSI, making use of the dashboard tool to investigate equity dimensions of active transport infrastructure in Montreal. So we can look at some other neighborhoods too and see where they're positioned relative to the whole region. And if we want, we can zoom in closer to the city, where our map of boroughs gets replaced with census tracts, and then eventually dissemination areas at the smallest scale of the city. And again, we can look at individual neighborhoods and understand their specific context. We've done a lot of work trying to communicate technical measurements in human language. So instead of saying, here is the standard deviation, we take the numbers that we measure and we convert them into words. So this is kind of interesting on its own. We can see how active living potential is distributed across Montreal. But where the power really comes in this particular tool, in the dashboard, is that we can also compare active living potential against a whole set of other metrics of urban life and urban sustainability in the city. So we've got some related to housing, related to income, related to immigration, related to transportation. I'll just choose here the percentage of new immigrants by neighborhood. When we do this, map changes to a bivariate comparative analysis of the distribution of active living potential, which is shown in green, and of the concentration of new immigrants by neighborhood, which is shown in blue. So we see a legend here that areas that are in this kind of charming color are places that have both a lot of active living potential and a lot of new immigrants, whereas blue areas have a lot of new immigrants without active living potential, and green areas have a lot of active living potential but not new immigrants. Now, our contextual information is updated as well to tell us that there's a strong positive correlation at the borough scale between these two variables. Shows us a little histogram, and again, we can click on a neighborhood and get particular contextual information about that neighborhood. To discover, for example, that the borough of Le Plateau, Montréal, has an extremely high active living potential score. It's higher than 99% of the boroughs and cities in Montreal, but only slightly lower new immigrant percentage compared to some of the other neighborhoods. We can see its point on the scatter plot. As with the map in general, we can zoom in on specific neighborhoods. And one of the things we learn is that as we zoom in closer and closer, we find that the relationship between active living and concentrations of new immigrants in Montreal is a scale-dependent one. At the borough scale, these two variables are very highly correlated. But by the time we get down to dissemination areas, so small neighborhoods, what we find is that the correlation has become quite weak. And so what we see is that at a kind of a more fine-grained scale, there are many neighborhoods which have a lot of active living or a lot of new immigrants, but fewer and fewer that combine the two. So we could do the same kind of analysis with another variable. Let's say, for example, walking or cycling to work. We would hope that areas where that have a lot of active living potential also have a lot of people using public transport. And indeed, we find an extremely high correlation between these two variables, which is good news. But we also see areas where there's a bit of a gap, and those are places where policy interventions could be useful. So, for example, blue areas in the west of Montreal here are places where lots of people are cycling or walking, but there isn't a lot of infrastructure to support them. I'm going to flip over to another one of our modules looking at pedestrian capacity for social distancing. Now, this is a topic that has been a lot of interest since the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And at the beginning of the summer, we were asking ourselves how we could take the dashboard that we're developing to answer some questions related to COVID. And one of them in particular was that we were seeing that there was a big uptick in local trips and in pedestrian mobility during the pandemic, and a lot of emphasis on the importance of social distancing. So we wanted to look at neighborhood by neighborhood where the capacity for social distancing was higher or lower. And when we start this map, we get a kind of a fun view that shows in 3D extrusion some of the neighborhoods with very low capacity to kind of give us a teaser. And as we zoom in, we get to see, again, kind of a dissemination area scaled version of this map that shows areas that have a high capacity for social distancing in green and areas lower in other colors. And again, that's interesting on its own, but we can, in this case, perform a bivariate analysis to compare those patterns with other patterns. So for example, now, to stick with the theme of immigrants and minorities that we developed before, we'll look at where visible minorities are located. in relation to pedestrian capacity for social distancing. And what we see is a cluster here of areas with a lot of visible minorities, but not a lot of capacity for social distancing. So we can kind of zoom in and see a little bit more what's going on here. This is the Côte de Neige area. One thing we can see is we can look at the plans that the city implemented to introduce new pedestrian infrastructure. We can see that in the original plan, Côte de Neige was not very well served. And in the revised plan, even worse served. What we can also do is we can filter what's on our map based on other variables. So, for example, we can look at areas that have that are more or less dense, and we can see that if we just narrow in on very dense areas here, we see a lot of that in Côte de Neige, which indicates that part of the story here is you've got lots of people living in very close proximity without the pedestrian realm to support them. Now, this tool was also designed to guide research. So actually, if you click for more information here, you get to see an example of how it works in practice and how our researchers have been able to use this information to come to conclusions about pedestrian infrastructure. And what's neat is if you zoom in all the way, what you get is a map that shows the street layout and shows you where sidewalks are wider or less wide to get a feel for how the pedestrian realm will to accommodate physical distancing. The last thing I want to show you before I wrap up is one last tool we have, which is analyzing the possibilities of converting travel in Montreal, commuting travel from cars to bikes. We have, as usual, a set of maps to look at where, for example, where trips are taken by car. We see that very few are taken in the central city by car, but as you get to outer points of the island, that situation changes. We can look at the average distance of a commute, very low in the central city, very high in the periphery. And we can look at how good the access to cycling infrastructure is. Again, it's very high in the center and very low in the periphery. But then if we zoom in, what we get, and this is the last thing I'll say before I wrap up, is a really cool tool to simulate modal shifts. By we model existing cycling routes, and what we see is that they're very heavily concentrated downtown. But we can also say, if people are willing to take cycling trips in other areas because there's better infrastructure, what implications that would have for vehicle miles traveled and for greenhouse gas emissions. And we can see that if people are willing to take average length trips on bike, which is 4.5 kilometers throughout the city, we'll see an enormous number of new trips generated. We can also incorporate more sophisticated information about elevation, about time that the trip will take, to see exactly where the possible benefits are for realizing more travel by bike. So we've got a ton more here, as you can imagine. We've got lots of background information about the dashboard and how it works. But the bottom line is that this is a tool designed for people to encourage a kind of iterative process of exploration, research, policymaking, and action. And our goal is to have this live ready to preview by this time tomorrow. So we're really looking forward to you playing around and letting us know what you think about it. Thank you very much.